Hello, hello, hello. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. I'm Robert Gelb, and this is Gordon
Hi.
Blackadder, and together we're going to have a little chat that we like to call Leaf and Bean about politics, both in the U.S. and the U.K., um, mostly filled with silly things that we stupidly decided to broadcast publicly over the internet. So. Um, so a lot to chat since last we spoke. I think the last time we spoke was right before the Scottish referendum,
Yep.
which was over a month and a half ago,
Yes, indeed.
or just about a month and a half ago. So I think we should talk about that. Have a little autopsy on that vote, and look and see what happened since then, and what that means for the UK in general. Then we'll also talk about Scottish Labour. That's been something that's been in the news, especially this week, but it does have wider implications for the rest of the UK. And the party conferences have also happened since September, so that's quite interesting as well. And then we'll move over to the U.S., where there are quite a few Senate races that people are talking about, not as many House races, and a few spatterings of governor's races. And so we'll go over the most exciting races, and then we'll have our famous quiz.
Yes, our famous quiz. I think we're probably
Sounds
going to
good.
spend most of the time talking about the Senate races, but we should take an opportunity, you're right, to look back at the Scottish independence results. As everybody now knows, Scotland voted against independence, and by a fairly large margin, 55 to 45, with an over 80% turnout. Actually, the turnout was just one of the most remarkable things about that election. I can't recall any election that came anywhere close to that. Certainly in Scotland, but really anywhere in the Western world. It was really an outstanding turnout. In the week or so before the election, you saw all the leaders of the main Westminster parties starting to panic that the result was going to go against them. So they all went north of the border to plead their case, and Gordon Brown got them all to sign up to a pledge of even more devolution to Scotland. And so and there seems to be a feeling amongst politicians that that pledge really had quite a transformative effect. Most of the people who I've seen interviewed have said they literally met and shook hands with people who were going to vote yes on independence, but they saw this pledge and they thought, well, you know what, we'll be able to get the best of both worlds. And so this pledge has now become a little controversial because there was a feeling that in the days after the referendum results, people were starting to backpedal. Labour was worrying that they would lose representation in Westminster if there was more representation given to the Scottish people because of the so-called West Lothian question. So you've had a whole lot of bickering about that. Actually, in the last few days or so, the Scottish Labour Party, which really should have been riding a wave since the election result went its way. It was campaigning strongly against the independence, but it's really just imploded since then. Possibly because of its association with the Tories, who they had to join with in order to campaign for this, or possibly because of just the feeling that they are a kind of London-based party. When Johann Lamont, the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, resigned, she said that her one of the people who works in the Scottish Labour Party was removed by the people in Westminster who run Labour without her consent or even talking to her, which is would be like Barack Obama removing somebody from the Arkansas or from, say, the Virginia Democratic Party without talking to the leader of the Virginia Democratic Party about it. So a lot of infighting going on there, and Labour really trying to find out what it stands for in a not an independent Scotland, but a more independent Scotland.
Yeah.
You've seen the SNP, despite having lost that, and despite having lost their extremely charismatic leader, Alex Salmond, recent polling showing them to be very successful in projections for the next set of elections. It's overwhelmingly likely they'll be re-elected as the majority party in Scotland. So so it's kind of interesting in terms of you would expect that winners would be doing well and losers would be doing badly, and actually quite the opposite. And I think possibly people may have voted the way they did out of a sense of realism, but they preferred the optimism of the yes campaign. And so now that everything's kind of going back to normal, nothing's really changed. Whereas before you had all this kind of hope and idealism, there seems to be a shifting in the tectonic plates of Scottish politics, which, as Alex Salmond, I think, was saying this morning, could take a generation to move back.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I also think though that the types of people that you were talking about who might have been either tempted to vote yes, but then ended up voting no because of the pledge. I think that's certainly there was certainly a chunk of those people, but there was a wider chunk of people that you know, were very hesitantly, but kind of taking Westminster at its word, or saying that they were going to take Westminster at its word for guaranteeing more powers to Scotland, whatever the result. You know, even though the result was no. And I think that it's those people. I think Alex Salmond mentioned that, you know, the Westminster will feel the wrath of the no voters relatively soon. And I actually thought I think that was actually a really interesting way of putting it, because I think you see you saw the desperation, the seeming desperation from the Westminster parties. You saw a lot of these promises that were made, and yes, no specific elements were necessarily outlined, and that was part of what many saw was the missteps of the no campaign. But at the same time, you did see some pretty specific promises that were made as well. There was a timetable, you know, November, draft legislation in November, vote starting in January. You saw a lot of politicians, whether they were reluctant or not, that started to say this. And I think you see a lot of no voters that were basically voting that way, giving them, let's say, the benefit of the doubt, but in the back of their minds are watching this very carefully. And I think that if that timetable isn't adhered to, or if it isn't adhered to, you know, relatively closely, and if the Scottish people don't start to see some of these changes, I don't think even the majority of no voters would blame the Scots for wanting another referendum in 5 years, or wanting it before a generation's out. And I think that the day of the referendum and having Alex Salmond resign was actually disappointing, not just to the yes voters, not just to the SNP, but also to a large contingent of no voters that might not have liked. They might not have liked Alex Salmond. He certainly wasn't necessarily popular, but he's very effective at what he does. He's known by a lot of no voters as a bully, but that can be a negative and a positive thing. And if you're a no voter that wants more powers for Scotland, which many do, or many did, having a bully like Alex Salmond there, ready to embarrass Westminster if they didn't stick to what they promised, was actually, you know, not a bad thing to have. Like, you know, an intimidation tool. And the loss of him and the backpedaling by David Cameron and others, I think that Westminster doesn't realize how tenuous their position is right now, and I think the only voice that I think a lot of Scots are encouraged to see come back into the fold is Gordon Brown, and that tells you something. When Gordon Brown is exciting people because you know, he's coming back and he's being passionate, it tells you that I think they're looking for some action here, and if action doesn't come, and if it doesn't come quickly, it doesn't matter any of the arguments about, you know, Scottish devolution should mirror, you know, or English devolution should mirror further Scottish devolution. I think a lot of Scots would say, great, have an English parliament, have several English parliaments, whatever you want to do, but don't hold it to the same timetable because that's not what you promised. And I think that those two issues are about to come to head in ways that the Westminster parties don't yet understand. So that's just my opinion.
Right.
I think you're right that Labour is looks like it's setting itself up to be a huge loser in this. The only positive, I think the SNP is hoping for up to 54 seats. I don't know if that's right, but or 51, 54 seats, and at least one. That's what one report had said. Obviously, that's unlikely to happen. But you could foresee a situation where Labour needs the SNP in order to govern. The Liberal Democrats don't seem to be benefiting at all from any of Labour's missteps, and it's going to be interesting. But I think that the Westminster, I think David Cameron might be assuming that the issue is settled, whereas I think that the goodwill will only run its course. That there's only a little bit of time to ensure that the goodwill is maintained. That makes sense.
I think you're absolutely right. There's almost an extent to which the fight over the next independence referendum has already started, and the no campaigners only win that fight if there's no referendum. If the Scottish people are content with the changes that happen over the next couple of years, then there won't be another referendum, and they will have won the debate. If we get to the stage where there was another referendum in 5 to 10 years because the Scottish people are just unhappy with the progress or rate of changes being made, then I see the result of that referendum being completely different from the previous one, and not even necessarily that close. I think probably
exactly. And I think also the assumption is from Westminster is, okay, come on, no one's going to want this. In another 5 to 10 years, the Scottish people are going to be disgusted if the SNP proposes this again, so we don't have to worry about that. And the reality is, I could see a lot of no voters saying, you know what, you screwed us, and you screwed us really, really badly. We have no faith in you. Let's hold another one, and let's leave. I can see that happening, and I think that if that did happen, the rest of the UK they wouldn't see it coming. You know? Especially the Westminster parties, but it just doesn't seem like they've gotten that yet.
No, they haven't gotten that yet. And actually, I think the reason Johan Lamont resigned was kind of to do with that issue. People in the Labour Party, in her opinion, really took the Scottish Labour Party for granted. They were always going to send 50 seats to Westminster and bolster the majority and so forth. And actually, I think she was saying that the leader of the Scottish Labour Party needs to be the leader of the entire party north of the border, and actually it needs to have a separate identity from the Labour Party south of the border, so that the Scottish Labour Party can actually fight and campaign on issues that it wouldn't necessarily campaign on south of the border. It needs to be a separate entity, and I think one of the reasons the SNP did so well north of the border, one of the reasons the SNP did so well in the Scottish elections was not necessarily actually because of increasing support for independence. The reason they did well in the elections was because they were a defined, separate party that was looking out for Scottish interests, which is what you want in a Scottish parliament. And there was a feeling that the Labour Party in Scotland was never going to do anything that could embarrass the party south of the border. They were going to appoint whatever leader was not going to overshadow the leader south of the border. And that really needs to change if the Scottish Parliament is going to do anything if the Labour Party are going to do anything with the power they get in the Scottish Parliament.
And I think what you said a little while ago that the feeling was that all top tier Labour candidates would go to Westminster. They wouldn't go to Holyrood.
Yeah.
And you've seen that reflected in the kind of anger or the irritation that's come out of a lot of Labour activists in Scotland. And I think even in this in the run up to this new leadership race, the feeling is that Scottish Labour, it kind of has a decision to make. It can either go to its more traditional more left of center roots, or it can follow the kind of the central government Labour direction and be more centrist. And it seems as though, especially with the loss of Alex Salmond, Nicola Sturgeon is very, very content in molding the SNP into a firmly a firmly left of center party, and that's worrying because a lot of traditional Labour voters might then be quite content to go to an SNP that doesn't really have a risk of launching another referendum battle in the near future. So that overwhelming issue can kind of be pushed to the side, and they can be a very high quality, very well run center-left party, and it seems as though Scottish Labour is having this kind of internal struggle with itself right now as to whether or not it wants to be a competitor with the SNP or whether it sees itself as something else.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting.
It will be interesting. All these polls should be taken with a touch of salt. The UK general election is about 9 months away or so, and the next Scottish Parliament election is until a year after that. So all of these things should be taken with a pinch of salt. And I think probably in the past, the SNP have done pretty well in the Scottish Parliament, and then haven't been able to carry through all of that momentum to Westminster elections because of a feeling that the UK-wide elections are about UK-wide issues rather than Scottish issues. But that could be changing if people think that they cannot vote for Labour and that the only way to get those kind of views and policies being heard in Westminster is to vote for the SNP.
Yeah, or just if they're those kind of middle no voters that certainly wanted more powers. Why vote for a Labour Party that you have no idea what they stand for, rather than vote for an SNP candidate whose main job while in Westminster is to make sure that Scotland gets the powers that they were promised. I can see that being a pretty easy argument for someone to take on. And so the elections are in May.
The elections are in May. Yeah.
Yeah. So just under seven months away, I think. So I think. Yeah. So I think it's certainly troubling for the Labour Party and also troubling for Ed Miliband because a lot of commentators are noting the fact that the Liberal Democrats are in tatters right now. The kind of national situation is ripe for a Labour takeover, and yet he doesn't seem to be.
Well, it's ripe for a Labour takeover because you're right. Not only the Liberal Democrats in tatters right now, they've just been annihilated over the last 5 years during the coalition, but also the Conservatives are being hit by from the right by the rise of UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, which recently gained its first two elected members of Parliament, recently gained its first elected member of Parliament, and I think is imminently about to gain its second member of Parliament in the form of Mark Reckless. You've seen that UKIP has been rising, and UKIP have been talking about trying to take votes from both the Conservatives and Labour, but recent elections have tended to show that they're really drawing mainly from Conservative voters. So you're right, Labour ought to be 10 points ahead in the polls right now. A year to go, opposition, a government that has presided over an economy that's maybe grown relatively well compared to Europe, but is not at full blast yet. They should be 10 points ahead, and they're nowhere close to that. And Ed Miliband is getting almost all the blame for that.
Yeah. Anyway, it's certainly been a very fascinating time to be in Scotland. I have to say that I thought that the vote went incredibly well. I enjoyed staying up and watching it. I felt very proud to have been able to take part in the vote, and I think that Scotland really showed the rest of the world how to conduct an election, even with a very high turnout. I read a report that there were 10 reports of someone who came in Glasgow who came up to vote, and it said that their name had already been. It said that they're already voted,
Yeah.
and so instead of being turned away, they were allowed to vote. And the little barcode that was attached to the person who said that they were that person's card was noted, and during the count, that ballot or all 10 of those ballots were found and invalidated. So the 10 instances of voter fraud were dealt with in such a simple manner. I don't know. I found the whole experience incredibly refreshing. And especially when you see all this trouble in the U.S. about voter ID and voting machines mysteriously not showing up at the places at the right time.
Yeah.
You know, I know that Scotland's a very small country, and there's not a lot of people in it, but the infrastructure worked. It accommodated 85%, 84% turnout. Everyone had enough time to vote. It was just a really, really great experience, and I'd hope that people would watch it.
Yeah.
And take note. Anyway.
Well, I think we've said everything has to be said, and if we talk about a referendum in 5 years' time, I think the result will be a foregone conclusion.
Yes, yeah. If it happens, that means that Westminster's failed, and they won't see it coming. Anyway,
we should talk about what's happening in America. We have the midterm elections happening on Tuesday. People are going to the polls to elect their governors, to elect their representatives in the House of Representatives, and some states are also electing senators as well. We haven't really had. Sorry, not all governors are up for election. Some governors are up for election. There's really been no talk whatsoever about the vote for the House of Representatives. While some representatives may win and some representatives may lose their seats, overall nobody expects the makeup of the House to change substantially. The Republicans are currently in control. Everyone expects that they will still be in control after the election. What is up for grabs, though, is the Senate. The Democrats currently have 55 to 45 of the seats, if you include 2 independents who usually caucus with them. And they're overwhelmingly likely to lose 4 seats. That's in Montana, West Virginia, South Dakota, and in Arkansas. And so the Republicans really only need to win a couple more seats on top of that in order to gain control of the Senate. So perhaps we can just go through some of the more interesting and competitive seats, and we'll just talk a little bit about that election. Perhaps we could start off in Kansas, where the Republican Pat Roberts was looking to cruise to victory against the Democratic opponent, and then this independent guy, Greg Orman, came in and really shook up the race. The Democrat withdrew from the race, although it turns out his name is still going to appear on the ballot. But it now appears that Greg Orman is neck and neck with Pat Roberts, who has been in the Senate for decades and decades and is now widely disliked in a Republican state for being too Washington. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that vote.
Well, I mean, Kansas is an interesting place. It is pretty dependably Republican in national elections. But if people are looking at a state like Kansas and they're thinking, well, there's no point in being a Democrat there or being an independent there, it's not. That's not seeing the whole picture. You know, it's not a sparsely populated state like Wyoming, right? It is it's a state. It's a suburban state. You know, a lot of there are a lot of soccer moms and dads and their cities, their rural areas, and internally the state, the state's Democratic Party has sometimes won elections. So to kind of assume that Kansas is just red only, wrong to do. Then you have the situation that's happening right now that's affecting both the Senate race as well as the governor's race in Kansas. The Kansas, well, for Pat Roberts, as you say, has been there for a long time. The notice that he's to Washington, I think there was a story that he listed his primary residence as in Virginia, Northern Virginia, or something like that. He hasn't really been back to the state very often. It's this issue that sometimes trips up long-serving senators that have been in Washington, just physically in Washington for a long time. They kind of get complacent, or they appear to get complacent, so you have that on one hand. You also have a lot of internal issues within Kansas, or internal decisions that the state government has made that have made some Republicans in the state very disliked. Right, the governor is having problems, and this just allows for openings for Democrats and Independents to take advantage. The kind of hullabaloo that was made when the Democratic candidate tried to pull out, and he has effectively pulled out, was in part, or was in totality a calculation that the independent Greg Orman, who himself has not said that he is a Democrat or goes with the Democrats. Obviously, it is still a red state. It's not like Greg Orman would say, I'm going to be listening to Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell. But he's also very clearly channeling that feeling of frustration and the feeling of, I'm fed up with the establishment. I'm fed up with the Republicans. And I think you combine that feeling, which is strong throughout the country, right? Being fed up with Washington, with a senator that seems very out of touch. The bottom of his website has an image of all these people like smiling at him when he's meeting them. Every single one of the people in that photo is from a stock image library that have been plopped there. Like I think that's a really good. Well, I think they've taken it down now, but it's a really good. His image of like an American road or fields is actually one in Australia. That is a good representation of the missteps that his campaign has had over the time. And so you combine that with the feeling of fed up, and he kind of becomes a bit of a scapegoat for everything that's wrong that people are complaining about in the state. So that's why I think it's interesting, and it looks like Greg Orman might pull it out. But I wouldn't underestimate. I think that the Republicans are coming in very late and late into Kansas. But I wouldn't still underestimate the natural ground advantage that the rest of the Republican machine has in Kansas, especially in that case. So I think Greg Orman has a higher chance than many in these races to have a bit of an upset, but still I don't think it's guaranteed.
So another race where it's very tight, but this on the other side is Louisiana. Mary Landrieu, who's the Democratic incumbent. It's a very close race. I think the last poll I saw showed the Republican just ahead, but it was pretty close. Perhaps you could talk a bit about that race. She's fantastically divisive in the state.
She is, and I think Louisiana is also an incredibly interesting state. Very, very large African American population. Also, quite a poor state. And also, the election is this system whereby the election is technically a primary, and it's just the top two candidates that then move on to a runoff. So we might actually not know the result of the Louisiana. We probably won't know the result of the Louisiana election on November 4th. But what you might have, and what polls look like, what it looks like it might happen is that Landrieu might actually get a higher percentage of the vote, but because she doesn't clear 50%, she's forced to go into a runoff. And then once you take out the remaining candidates, the Republican is it Cassidy? I've got a blank on the candidate's name. But it looks like the Republicans then edging her out in that kind of toe-to-toe matchup. So interestingly, Louisiana, I mean, a lot of people were thinking that, well, if the Democrats did have a route to keep the Senate, it very well might be which is looking very tenuous. But if that was the case, then it might be that the control of the Senate wouldn't be known until whenever the runoff is, which is, I think, either later in November or the beginning of December, but I'm not sure. So yeah, it's a very interesting race. She came out a few days ago and said, it's very hard for African Americans in the state, and it's very hard for Barack Obama in the state because to come and visit, and because of his race and how there's still divisions. That was very divisive, obviously. But again, she has survived before, and so there are always these kind of candidates that manage to eke out one way or another. I don't think she has enough in order to guarantee that, but it's definitely an interesting race.
Well, and we've got a similar thing going on in Georgia. Is a Republican incumbent, David Perdue, and there's a lot of Democratic support for Michelle Nunn, who I think in recent polling is within 2 or 3 points or so of Perdue. But again, you've got the runoff thing, and there's just a feeling that in 30 days' time, or whenever the runoff vote happens, when there's nothing else being voted for, and there's no other momentum, there's no other reason to go to the polls, it's going to be even. I mean, if Democrats manage to get a runoff, it will only be because they had a really aggressive ground game, and in 30 days' time, that will be that much harder to be able to pull off.
And I think that Georgia has a slightly higher chance of going the Democrats' way, just because of the sheer number of activists it has in the state. It also has potential of they have the potential of getting the governor's race. Carter is doing surprisingly well. Michelle Nunn is also the child of a famous Georgia politician, so that certainly can help. And if it turns out that it does go to a runoff, and if it turns out that the races in Louisiana and Georgia are the ones that matter in terms of deciding which way the Senate goes, then I think that it turns into a slightly different race than normal, because you will have both parties just focusing on those two races. And so I think then it turns both of them into the national race. The battle for the Senate is these two elections, and so I think that's the only way that I think that you might not have the drop off of interest. If it's clear that Republicans have, if it goes to a runoff, and if it's clear the Republicans have won the Senate and they've already taken it away, I think you will find then a huge drop off and a much higher likelihood for the Republican to succeed. So yeah, definitely a very, very interesting race.
And another interesting race, which a few months ago was pretty much a dead cert for Democrat Mark Udall in Colorado, who's the incumbent. It's now looking increasingly likely. In fact, I don't think there have been any recent polls that have shown him in the lead against Cory Gardner, the Republican. Perhaps you could talk a bit about that. Mark Udall's really had a very tough time of it.
Yeah, surprisingly, I mean, Mark Udall, or the Udall name is well known in Colorado as well as in New Mexico. It's kind of a little political dynasty that's been going on there. Yeah, I mean, Udall just hasn't been performing very well. I mean, some people think that the Libertarian Party is having some impact on Democrats a little bit more than it used to. Also, some people are seeing the fact of the various changes that have been happening in Colorado. The legalization of marijuana, is this a reaction, against that? And also just the kind of the ways that Udall hasn't really been as active as perhaps he could be, or at least as visible as perhaps he could be, and the surprising tenacity, if you want to call it that, of Gardner. I think it's worthy to note that, like, this time last election cycle and the time before, the big stories were the stupid things that the Republican candidates were saying. It was Republican misstates. Republican says, women can shut down pregnancies from rape. Republicans says stupid thing, and that became the story. You're not seeing that this cycle. You're seeing a few missteps by both sides. You're seeing embarrassing comments, but you're not seeing that kind of explosive kind of example of idiocy, especially by the Republicans. And I think that that's a credit to the National Republican Committee, to Reince Priebus, the Republicans have this new, apparently they have this secret media training intensive course that all their candidates have to go and do. The candidates they've been choosing are higher quality than the last cycle. They are not stepping in it as much as they did last cycle, and they're not being as doomsday negative as they were last cycle. They're not being entirely positive. It's not like a wave election. I don't think anyone's saying that this is a wave election because of overwhelming positivity towards the Republicans. It's still a rejection of Washington, and because the Democrats are in Washington and in control of the Senate, it is naturally then a rejection of them. It's also affecting local policies. But I do have to say that the lack of Republican missteps, I think, is a huge benefit to them in this election, unlike it was previously. Well, did you have anything to add about Colorado?
Not about Colorado, but I just feel like all of the votes we've talked about. I mean, obviously, a Senate election, a senator is very much more is a very public face, whereas representatives may not be as well known in the state. But I feel like all of these elections we're talking about are really being defined by each state. There's no feeling, as you just said, of a Republican wave. There's no feeling that, hey, we're going to vote Republicans and then these policies are going to be enacted. There's really been no discussion of policy. They've been spending much more time talking about the Ebola virus and the threat of ISIS than they've been talking about what policies are going to be enacted. And that's because everybody knows that this election happens. Barack Obama is still president, so he can veto anything that a Republican House and Senate can manage to pass. And in any case, this election happens, and then we're into the presidential election where everybody's, again, just kind of seized up and doesn't want to vote in any way. Obama has spent all his political capital and so forth. This is really not an election about anything. It's just, and I feel like the reason the Republicans are winning, are going to take over the Senate, is just because Democrats have many more senators to lose this time round.
Yeah.
We just went through a bunch of close Senate races. Actually, Republicans are likely to lose in Kansas and possibly in Georgia as well. It's just that Democrats won so many seats 6 years ago when Barack Obama was elected president in 2008. They just have so many more to lose this time round. And so it's just a cycle. So my opinion of this race is it's not a race about anything except the billions of dollars that are being spent. If we can spend a moment talking about North Carolina, where Kay Hagan, I think, is recent polling is actually showing her pulling ahead, but she's enormously unpopular in North Carolina.
Well, she's managed to hold on to. She's managed to hold on to her lead. And it seems like, as you're saying, it's not necessarily about anything. I do though think that different states, the microcosms within the states are interesting as well. You're seeing certain states where the governor's race seems to be going one way and the senator's race is going a completely different way. So you're seeing some interesting, and then you're seeing it all match up correctly. The senator from Kansas is doing badly. The governor from Kansas is doing badly. And yet you're at the same time you're seeing the opposite happen. And I think that in North Carolina, it's kind of been the story of what the Democrats would have probably hoped for elsewhere, right? The Republican challenger isn't getting as much excitement as they could, and Hagan, yes, unpopular, but still not unpopular enough That makes sense.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think the Democrats are breathing a sigh of relief about North Carolina. I think is it Tillis? Tillis is not. Yeah, Tom Tillis is not performing, I think, as well as the Republicans would hope. But also, the Libertarian candidate, I think his name is like Hugh or Hall, is also polling a bit. I think that in the states that the Democrat seems to be holding on or performing better, you are having a Libertarian candidate coming in and siphoning off 5%, 6% of the vote. I think that's also a factor in North Carolina as well.
So I think probably a few months ago, the most interesting race was in Kentucky. That was Mitch McConnell, who is not only the incumbent, but he's also the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, against Democrat Allison Lundgren Grimes. That race has become a lot less interesting and a lot less close. It looks like Mitch McConnell was going to win by between 5 and 10 points. The New York Times is currently giving him a 93% chance of being reelected. It looked like it could have been closer a few months ago, or at least Democrats were more excited about it a few months ago. A few weeks ago, they pulled their funding from there, saying that extra funding, extra money on the ad wars wasn't going to make a difference, and they were going to focus on the ground game. That race, it never became really close, but it was interesting that the leader of the Republicans in a reasonably red state, a reasonably conservative state, was having to fight so hard to hold on, first being whacked from the right by a primary challenger, and then being whacked by Allison Lundgren Grimes. Perhaps you could talk about that.
I think with Kentucky, look, it's the leader of the opposition. It's the leader of the Republicans. So anytime a candidate is above 30%, I think people get excited, right? Because they want to see the big candidate go down, the big sitting powerhouse get rocked and get worried, and you want to see him sweat, right? The exact same thing happened with Harry Reid in Nevada. However, Harry against Sharon Angle last time. However, Harry Reid's election with Sharon Angle was very, very different, and the Republicans were much closer in taking that than the election with Grimes and McConnell this time. So I think that's on one hand. You also combine it with someone who couldn't be more different than Mitch McConnell, right? You have a younger woman who is an incredibly capable candidate, right? It's not a whack job candidate, kind of like Sharon Angle was. And suddenly 35%, her polling at 35%, gives people a feeling of, wow, actually, she's actually pretty good. Or like a pretty good candidate. She can keep up. Maybe this will turn into something. Maybe it'll get there. It never really has. Kentucky is while it does have a Democratic governor, it is a pretty reliably red state. And I don't think people would be assuming that Allison Grimes is losing this election. But at the same time, I think if the tables had been turned slightly, and if the Democrats were looking at a very good election, this could certainly have been one that they would have picked up, like a nice pickup. It's also shown Mitch McConnell to be to get worried, right?
Yeah.
And I think that you haven't seen that before. So I think it's wrong to say that in the final days McConnell has suddenly found his voice and is now going to be okay. But at the same time, I don't think it's right to say that the Democratic candidate was always a pipe dream. She obviously gave him a bit of a run. It just seems as though all the races are now settling. And I don't know if you read Political Wire, I guess this is a comment about them all generally. One of the interesting things about the Political Wire polling that's been released, every day there's a new poll that comes out, and frankly, one after another, a poll will say almost the exact opposite right? And there are polls that are out that say Allison Grimes is at 44% and Mitch McConnell's only at 41%. And then the next day it'll say that Mitch McConnell's at 47% and Grimes is at 40%. And you're seeing that with every single race, basically. Every single race except for Montana and a few others. The only difference is that the polls that come out that say the Republican candidate is higher number more than the ones that come out for the Democrat. And that's why I think that, yes, it might be closer than one thinks, but it most likely Mitch McConnell is going to come. I'd say he's going to win at least maybe by 6 points. But I don't think that then will be or should be taken necessarily as a failure on her side.
No,
Ashley Judd almost jumping in the race didn't hurt the race, and it's kind of Hollywood aspect either.
So we talked a lot about Senate races. I think there's still time to talk about a couple of governor's races. Scott Walker, who's a Republican and conservative favorite for shouting down having a showdown with the unions a few years ago, and is definitely talked about as a contender for the Republican presidential nomination, is running for re-election in Wisconsin and having a slightly hard time of it.
Yeah, and I think this is interesting for a couple of reasons. You're seeing kind of on one hand you're seeing Scott Walker ask if he's going to run for president, but then on the other hand running a surprisingly close re-election race, for his own governorship as well. And I think that right now, like again, depending on the day, you're seeing different candidates being on top. And I think right now, Real Clear Politics labels it as a toss-up. I do Scott Walker at this point. I think he's going to eke it out. But Mary Burke, who's challenging him, I think has surprised a lot of people in mounting a really, really serious challenge. And I think you're seeing this happen in Wisconsin. You're seeing it happen in Michigan to a smaller extent, which is also interesting. What can this be traced to? It could be traced to the fact that Walker overplayed his hand, or people feel like he overplayed his hand with the unions. But it also could be that he just hasn't been watching the polling very closely, and he hasn't been doing all he can in the campaign. I think it ends up being a mixture of both. But incumbent Republican governors are finding it a little challenging right now. Whether you're in Michigan, Wisconsin, Florida. I mean, Florida is another race that I think is. I think you can count 2 incumbent governors in that race. So I mean, complicated as well. But I mean, even Alaska is a bit of a toss-up right now. So it's not looking so great for Republican governors in certain states. But at the same time, some Democratic states. I mean, Massachusetts, Connecticut, even Rhode Island. I mean, those aren't being locked down by Democrats yet, I find that really interesting as well.
I could talk a bit more about the Rhode Island race between Gina Raimondo and Alan Fung. Gina Raimondo, despite being the Democrat, has problems of being associated with Wall Street. She's had a lot of money from Wall Street firms, and so there's kind of a reticence on the part of Democrats to go out and vote for her. So that might depress turnout a little bit there as well. There's also the exciting Providence mayor's race where Yorga Elorza, who's the Democrat, is running against former mayor and independent Buddy Cianci. Buddy Cianci is the former mayor because he has twice been mayor in the past and twice has been deposed from office and then convicted of corruption and imprisoned. So that's an exciting race to watch. Currently, he's 10 points behind, but it could get closer on the night.
Right. So do you want to just quickly give a shout out to the races that you think might be surprising or ones that you're going to be watching closely?
Well, I think I'm going to be watching the same kind of set of 8 races that everybody is. I'm inclined to think that Kentucky is going to go the way it's going to go. I hadn't realized that North Carolina had sorry, not North Carolina, that Louisiana had the runoff system until you just said that. So actually, the race is a lot less interesting now, but could be fantastically interesting, indeed pivotal in a couple of in just a few days' time. I think I'm going to be watching the Georgia race, which also has that runoff, and I'm going to be interested to see the Kansas race as well with independent Greg Orman. What are you watching?
I think for the governor's races, I think that I think Connecticut is just an interesting. I think Malloy's going to hold. He's the current Democratic governor, but I think it's going to be pretty close, a little closer than people thought. I think that Scott Walker is going to hold, but I think that that'll also be closer than anyone thought. I also think that Alaska might be an interesting race. Colorado, the current Democratic governor Hickenlooper seems to be in real trouble, and his is a very interesting story anyway. For some reason, I have a feeling he's going to eke it out, but not sure. Florida, I have no idea. I have a feeling that Chris could do something just because Rick Scott is so divisive. So I think you can see Florida. You might see Florida skip. And then for the Senate races, I think New Hampshire. I think Hagan's going to eke it out. I am going to say that in Georgia, I have a feeling that Nunn is going to get into the lead but not get enough to avoid a runoff. In Louisiana, I think that Landrieu might get more on the night, but then lose the runoff. I think Kansas is definitely one to watch. I think Orman might eke it out. Iowa is also, I think, one to watch. I think Bruce Braley, the Democrat, had been feeling a little confident. I don't think he might eke that one out either. So I think on the night you're going to see I think you're going to see a Republican-controlled Senate. I don't think the Republicans are going to end up with 60 seats or 58 seats or I don't think it's going to be a huge number. But I think that they're going to have at least 1 to 2 majority that's clear on election night. And I think that if that being the case, then I think they have a much higher chance of winning both the Louisiana and the Georgia elections because of it. So that could increase them to 4. So that's what I think.
Well, we'll find out what happens on Tuesday night.
Absolutely.
Polls close at different times in different states, but the average seems to be about 8 p.m. or so. So I imagine by midnight Eastern Standard Time, the result will be beginning to come in. They'll be starting to call these states, and you might have an inkling of whether it's going to be Democrats just holding their own, or if the Republicans going to have a small or a large majority.
And also, the farther west you go, except for Alaska, the more clear that it seems like it's going to be. So that's also why it might be an early night.
I see then. I think it's probably time in the last 7 minutes for our world-famous quiz.
Yes.
My quiz questions have a bit of a theme. I'm not going to give away the theme, but I think it will become obvious by the end.
I bet they're all about elephants.
But well, yeah, I think I'd have a good chance of winning this week's quiz if that was the case. Do you want to go first, or shall I? You
go. Age before beauty.
So there's oh wow, that was harsh. There's as I said a few minutes ago, the Providence mayor's race features former mayor Buddy Cianci. But which former mayor of Providence said in his book this? People believe that the last thing a mayor should do is raise taxes. That's completely wrong. The first thing a mayor should do when he takes office is raise taxes, and then blame it on the previous administration.
Is this a famous mayor?
This is a famous mayor.
Is it Buddy Cianci?
It is Buddy Cianci in his book. Yep. Buddy Cianci. There you go. Okay, you get 1 point.
No, when I found out about Buddy Cianci, then suddenly a long-running joke in Family Guy made sense. They all went to Buddy Cianci Junior High School. And I didn't know what that meant. Anyway, my turn.
Your turn.
So the midterms are, of course, a few days away. However, the first presidential primary debate has already been scheduled. What month has the first debate of the 2016 election now just been scheduled for? Just the month and the year.
It's probably ridiculously early. Well, so it must be 2015 sometime. I'm going to go for July 2015? June 2015. I'm going to go for June.
So it's actually September 2015, and it's the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. They've announced that it will invite GOP presidential candidates to attend a televised debate at the Reagan Library in September of 2015. So they have just said right now, they're like, we don't know who it's going to be, but it's going to happen in September and it's going to be here.
Okay. Okay, so my next question is this. Which former mayor of Providence boasted in his book about delaying building permits for Brown University until they admitted his nephew, saying in his book, I use my public power for personal reasons, I admit it. It probably wasn't the right thing to do, but it certainly felt good.
Was it Buddy Cianci?
It was Buddy Cianci. It was Buddy Cianci.
I think I'm on to your your formula here.
Okay. Well, you'll have to wait until the next question to find out.
So in Hong Kong, obviously there's some unrest going on, and there's a bit of tension between activists in Hong Kong and the government that is allied with the central government in China. So what did an executive council member liken the people of Hong Kong to in a statement recently? This is a little controversial, but the person said that the people of Hong Kong she likened the situation to another plight of people in history.
The plight of a people in history. I don't know. Sorry, they reference it to the plight of a particular people, but in a very derogatory manner.
Well,
I don't know. What's the answer?
This is the quote. American slaves were liberated in 1861, but did not get voting rights until 107 years later. So why can't Hong Kong wait for a while?
Wow. My goodness. That's astonishing. That's astonishing. Yeah. So I'm going to preface this question by just saying that Blue Cross is the name of a health insurance plan that exists in England. So which former mayor of Providence said in his book, in which he was negotiating with the police unions, with the leader of the police union, about getting Blue Cross for the members of the police force, and he said in his book they decided to play pinball, and if I won, meaning the mayor, then the police union leader would never mention Blue Cross again. But if I lost, I would give it to them. The mayor lost the pinball game, and that's how the police officers union got Blue Cross for life.
Was it Buddy Cianci?
It was Buddy Cianci. It was Buddy Cianci.
I'm on a roll.
You are actually at 3 points. I think you're tied even with any quiz that either of us have taken in the last 2 years.
Yes,
so
absolutely. And okay, so in Staten Island, this is actually a story about a congressional race, right? The Staten Island Advance is a newspaper there, and it's decided to endorse the Republican. Why is that? Why is that weird?
Is this one of the cases where, like, the Republican candidate or whoever died, but their name still appears on the ballot?
No. So the Republican incumbent in Staten Island is currently Michael Grimm, who is facing a 20-count federal indictment.
Wait.
Yeah, and so this is the Staten Island Advance's endorsement of him. They said, on the one side is a sometimes hot-headed Republican incumbent who's facing a 20-count federal indictment. On the other is a career Brooklyn Democratic Paul, who, term limited out of his high-ranking post in the city council, thought about other city offices before he settled on the idea of a job representing in Congress a borough he knows little about, his claims of deep ties here notwithstanding. That's the choice voters have, and that's the choice we have in making an endorsement in a race that could not be much uglier. The choice for us is Michael Grimm. Surprisingly, if a choice is to be made, Mr. Grimm should be that choice, even under these circumstances. So they hate the fact that someone from outside of their borough, so as in probably less than 5 miles away, is running against a guy who has been indicted on 20 counts.
Goodness. Okay, so which former mayor of Providence, who, when he was running for election in 1990 against two pro-choice candidates,
did he say this in his book?
Said in his book, honestly, I didn't really have an opinion, but he declared himself to be pro-life, quoting, why not? Was it hypocritical? I prefer to think of it as political. I was in a close race, and I knew there were a considerable number of pro-life zealots searching for a candidate. I could stand for anything. It didn't matter.
Was it Buddy Cianci?
It was Buddy Cianci. Buddy Cianci in his book, current mayoral candidate in Providence. You're currently on 4 for 4, which is, I think, a record.
Yep. Well, here's something about your state, right? President Obama spent the night in your state, I think, last week, that was a big deal for at least one little probably intern that was handed down the assignment to get statistics for this particular story. When was the last time that a sitting president has spent the night in Rhode Island?
Spent the night. I know that George Bush visited Rhode Island, but I'm not actually sure if he spent the night. And I definitely know that George Washington spent the night in Rhode Island when Rhode Island first signed the Constitution. So I'm trying to bookmark somewhere between George Washington and Barack Obama, not including George Bush. I'm gonna go for Bill Clinton.
All right. No, it's been 50 years since the sitting president has slept in Providence, in Rhode Island, and that was JFK. Goodness,
that's really quite remarkable. Okay, so final question: which former mayor of Providence has his own radio talk show and also his own brand of pasta sauce, which was sold with the proceeds going to charity, but according to recent reports, over the last several years has given only $3 to charity?
All right. It probably wasn't Tavares, and it probably wasn't Sicilline, and it probably wasn't.
No, I don't think any of these guys have their own brand of pasta sauce.
It probably wasn't Roberts. Let's go with Buddy Cianci.
It was Buddy Cianci. That was Buddy Cianci.
Who would have thought it?
You win 5 out of 5 of those questions, and Buddy Cianci currently 10 points behind in the polls, but apparently there were some rumors that he might have voted more than once in previous elections. So who knows?
You must love his book.
I haven't read all the book, but it's certainly honest in places.
That's great. Okay, last question for you. There's been this review into the Secret Service's 2012 prostitution scandal, right? And the chief investigator was from the Department of Homeland Security. But the chief investigator investigating the prostitution scandal has had to resign from being the investigator. Why?
I I feel like I should have heard about this story. It sounds like it was a big deal, but I haven't heard anything about this story. So presumably it wasn't something as ironic as being involved in a prostitution scandal himself, because that... Oh, he was? He was involved in a prostitution scandal? No way. My goodness.
He quietly resigned in August after he was implicated in his own incident involving a prostitute.
Wow. Wow, that's incredible.
There we go.
Well, so I'm afraid I got 0 and you got 5 out of 5, which I think is the
got one.
largest
You got
margin.
one. You got the last one.
I got the last one. I got the. That's true. That's true. I was ahead of myself. I just assumed I wasn't gonna get it. But anyway, I think winning by 4 makes you the largest margin of victory in 2 years in this show. Perhaps I will vary my answers for the next.
All right. Well, I think next time we'll certainly go over the results of the midterms. Are you going to be staying up to watch the returns?
I will stay up, but hopefully not too late. So we'll see what happens.
Not too late. Okay. Alrighty. Well,
it's
until then. Yes. Oh yeah. I'll try.
Okay.
Or wake up early. Either way. All right. Well.
Okay.
Have
so
fun.
our next show next week. We'll see you then.
All right.